Beneath the glass dome of Chicago Symphony Hall, the air glimmers like a held breath. Velvet gowns ripple like dark water. Diamonds catch the chandelier light, scattering it across a sea of faces that smile too wide, drink too much, and whisper too softly. On this night, the night when the city's wealthiest gather to congratulate themselves, Leona Carter steps into a room that was never meant to hold her. Not tonight. Not according to the man who swore to love her. She isn't supposed to be here. And that's exactly why she came. If this moment already has your pulse quickening, stay with me. What happens next isn't just about love or betrayal. It's about the moment a woman realizes she's been written out of her own story and decides to take the pen back. If you've ever felt erased, overlooked, or underestimated, this is your story too. Tap the heart, share your thoughts in the comments, and follow along. What's coming is going to leave a mark. William Preston stands near the center of the ballroom, perfectly at ease in his tailored tuxedo, holding court beneath a chandelier that cost more than the house Leona grew up in. His laugh rings out, low and polished. Around him cluster investors, developers, people who shape skylines and neighborhoods with contracts scribbled on napkins over cocktails. And at his side, where Leona should have been, stands her, Clara Monroe. 26, white, the kind of beautiful that makes doors open faster. She's wearing a red silk gown and the diamond cuff William once promised Leona would be hers for their anniversary. A promise, like so many others, that dissolved into smoke. From the balcony landing, Leona watches his hand rest lightly on Clara's waist as he introduces her to a Wellington Trust board member. The same Wellington Trust that told William his next contract depended on presenting the right image. The same William who, 3 hours ago, brushed her cheek with a kiss and said she was too tired to attend. The orchestra swells, a delicate, expensive sound. Leona's pulse beats harder beneath it. 8 years of marriage, 8 years of boardrooms and blueprints, and standing beside him at every ribbon cutting. She built his world brick by brick, while he quietly built an exit door. And tonight, in front of Chicago's elite, he's walked through it with someone else on his arm. The crowd moves like a tide, swirling around William, pulling him further into the center, further away from her. But Leona isn't drowning. Not tonight. She's standing perfectly still, like the moment before a fault line shifts. She steps down from the balcony, one hand on the marble railing. She walks through the ballroom, the soft fabric of her emerald dress whispering with every step. Eyes follow her, not because they expect a scene, but because they sense a storm moving toward the shore. William hasn't seen her yet. Clara laughs at something he says, a practice sound. His jaws relaxed, his shoulders loose. A man too sure of his control over the story. That's his first mistake. Leona reaches the edge of the circle around him and stops, not to confront him, not yet. She lets the silence do the work. People notice her first, a woman in green where no woman in green was expected. One by one, heads turn. And then William sees her. His smile freezes. The charm in his posture fractures just a little. Clara's fingers tighten on his arm. Around them, champagne flutes pause halfway to lips. This is the moment. The glass begins to crack. Leona doesn't say a word. She doesn't need to. The room is already listening, and the man who once told her to stay home now stands under a chandelier, exposed by nothing but her presence. This night, this exact moment, is not an ending. It's the beginning of a reckoning. Because some women don't shatter when the glass breaks. They become the storm that brings the ceiling down. The first time Leona Carter saw William Preston, the air smelled like polished wood and ambition. It was a gray afternoon in downtown Chicago, the kind where the city seemed to hum under its breath. The Urban Futures Development Conference was being held at the Cultural Center, a place that echoed with old-world grandeur and new-world deals. Architects, developers, investors, planners, they all came to pitch their visions of the city's tomorrow. Leona had been invited to present her concept for the Willow District Renewal, a modest but elegant plan to bring sustainable housing and public spaces to a forgotten neighborhood. She was only 29 then, still more at home behind a drafting table than beneath the glare of chandeliers. But her work was strong, thoughtful, beautiful in a quiet, grounded way. William entered like someone who believed every door was meant to open for him. He was 34, already the founder of a rapidly growing real estate investment firm. His name traveled through the conference hall like a rumor. Bold, charming, unstoppable. He found her after her presentation, while the last slide of her design faded from the screen. "You built hope into a floor plan," he said without introduction. His voice was warm, smooth. "That's not something you see often in this business." Leona laughed, startled by his directness. "I don't build hope," she replied. "I build structure. Hope just finds a way in." He smiled like someone who had just spotted his next great acquisition. But in that moment, she mistook it for admiration. They talked for hours in the crowded foyer, their words slipping between conversations about zoning codes and favorite books, architectural theory and childhood dreams. She told him how she grew up in Detroit, watching her grandmother fight for the right to keep a community center from being demolished. He told her how his parents struggled to rise from bankruptcy, how he'd promised himself he'd never be powerless again. There, beneath the stained glass dome, something dangerous and dazzling began. Their courtship unfolded like a perfectly scripted film. William sent flowers, not just roses but orchids, tulips, peonies, chosen to match the palette of her projects. He took her to rooftop dinners overlooking the skyline she loved, whispering about the future as if they were already living it. He loved the way she spoke about cities as living beings, about how buildings could heal people. She loved the way he seemed to understand ambition without flinching. 3 months later, they flew to Paris. He proposed on a bridge over the Seine with a vintage ring that sparkled under the lamplight. 6 months after that, they married at an art museum in front of a glass wall that framed the Chicago skyline like a promise. Their wedding was an event people whispered about for years. Elegant, expensive, seamless. She wore a dress that felt like silk and air. He wore a smile that looked like victory. And somewhere between the champagne toasts and the polished speeches, Leona began to build a future in her mind. A future where they would create together. She would design, he would build. Their love would be their foundation, their legacy. For a while, it almost felt real. But even then, the cracks had begun, small, nearly invisible. At meetings, William often introduced her not as Leona Carter, architect, but as my fiancée, Leona. Later, as my wife. Never quite as my partner. At galas, when she wore bold colors that reflected her joy, he'd gently suggest, "Black looks more elegant on you. It photographs better." When she spoke passionately about community projects, he'd rest his hand lightly on her wrist, a silent signal to wrap it up, to return the spotlight to him. He didn't silence her outright. He simply made her smaller, bit by bit, until the space she occupied beside him became more ornamental than equal. She convinced herself it was love, that his obsession with appearances was harmless, that it was the price of being part of something bigger. He built empires out of glass and concrete. She built trust out of dreams. And though their names sat side by side on the foundation plaques of a dozen projects, it was his voice people heard, his face on the cover of magazines. Still, she stayed, because she believed the vision they shared was real, because in the beginning, it almost was. In those early years, the city stretched out before them like a blueprint, and Leona didn't yet know that while she was sketching futures, William was already drawing lines around her, a frame too small for the woman she was becoming. It began quietly, not with a fight or a slammed door, but with a soft suggestion wrapped in silk. The first time William told Leona to skip a dinner, it almost sounded kind. He walked into their kitchen after work, still in his slate gray suit, carrying a bottle of Pinot Noir, and the smile he wore when he wanted to convince her of something. "Babe," he said, leaning against the marble counter, as if the weight of the world rested lightly on his shoulders. "Tomorrow night's meeting with the Westmont investors is going to be brutal. Old money, conservative. They're traditional about these things. It might be easier if I handle it solo." He said it with that easy, persuasive tone that had once made her feel chosen. The words slid into the air like a practiced melody. Leona, standing barefoot in the warm light of their kitchen, stared at him over the rim of her tea mug. She was dressed simply. A soft green wrap dress that hugged her waist, gold hoops glinting against her dark skin. She'd already been planning what to wear to that dinner, already pictured herself sitting at that table, listening, contributing. She had helped design the project those investors were funding. "You mean," she said slowly, "you don't want me to come?" His laugh was quick, a deflection. "No, no, that's not what I said. Of course I want you there. But these people, they expect a certain image. It's all strategy, sweetheart, optics. If I keep it lean, clean, business-focused, it gives us an edge." She wanted to believe him, and so she nodded. But something inside her, a voice she had spent years training to stay quiet, shifted uncomfortably. It didn't stop with one dinner. It became a pattern. First the Westmont dinner, then the reception with the Alderbridge donors, then a charity brunch with the Wellington Trust. Each time, William's reasoning grew more refined, more polished. They respond better to a tight leadership presence. It's not personal, it's just positioning. I promise when the deal's locked, we'll celebrate properly. Each explanation came dressed like strategy, but beneath the surface, something uglier pulsed. He started making comments about her wardrobe. "That red suit is bold, Leona. Maybe too bold for them. About her hair. You know they're old-fashioned. Maybe the curls are a bit much. About her very presence. I just don't want them distracted. You know how these people can be." She smiled through it, at first, told herself it was temporary. Business was ruthless. Optics mattered. They were building a legacy together, weren't they? Sometimes love required patience. Sometimes partnership meant stepping aside so the other could step forward. But every time she stepped aside, the space she left behind grew a little colder. Leona began to notice the small shifts in their world, the way his colleagues stopped including her in planning emails, how her name disappeared from invitations to events where it used to be printed right beside his, the way William spoke about his firm, his projects, as though her fingerprints weren't pressed into every blueprint. And still, when he came home late with expensive wine and tired apologies, when he touched her hand and murmured, "It's just business," she let herself believe him. Because the alternative, that the man she loved was slowly pushing her out of the world she helped build, was too devastating to name. There were nights she stood in front of their floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights burn like constellations beneath the Chicago sky. She'd imagine all the buildings she'd dreamed of designing, the neighborhoods she wanted to touch with beauty and dignity. She had thought William shared that vision, but somewhere along the way the dream had split, his orbit pulling farther from hers, like two stars once entwined, now drifting apart. The next time he went to a donor event without her, Leona didn't argue. She just stood in the doorway of their apartment, watching him adjust his cufflinks in the mirror. His reflection looked back at him with the ease of a man convinced the world belonged to him. "Don't wait up," he said, pressing a kiss to her cheek. She caught the faintest trace of cologne and champagne on his breath. The door clicked shut. The silence that followed wasn't just silence anymore. It was the sound of something shifting beneath the foundation. A hairline crack forming in the walls of their life. A crack she couldn't yet name, but she felt it. And she knew, structures don't crumble all at once. They fracture quietly, in places no one looks, until one day the weight is too much to hold. It was late. Too late for strategy meetings. The kind of late when the city outside had gone quiet. The lake was a sheet of black glass, and their penthouse floated above it all like a sealed aquarium. Leona had been working at her drafting table, sleeves rolled up, a pencil smudged against the side of her hand. The sound reached her first. William's voice, low and smooth, rising from the living room. Another voice joined his, sharper, harder. Thomas Drake, William's closest ally, his fixer, his shadow. She hadn't known Thomas was coming tonight, but then she hadn't known about a lot of things lately. Leona leaned back slightly in her chair, the soft scratch of graphite falling away. Their voices carried down the hallway. She didn't mean to eavesdrop at first. She simply didn't move. "I'm telling you, Will," Thomas said, his tone tight. "The Wellington Trust isn't just another investor group. This is generational money, 4 centuries of it. They fund hospitals, universities, entire city blocks. They don't play games with people who don't fit their picture." "I know exactly who they are," William replied. She could hear the crisp clink of a whiskey glass being set on the table. "That's why I'm handling this carefully." "Carefully isn't enough," Thomas said. "They're old school. Old money. Very particular about how things look. Their boardroom isn't just about numbers, it's about image, optics. You know what I'm talking about. Silence. Then William's voice, lower now. Yeah, I know. The pencil slipped from Leona's hand and rolled across the floor. She froze, back pressed to the cool wall of the hallway, every muscle alert. She should have walked away. She should have announced herself. But some part of her, an older, quieter part, already understood that whatever was about to be said wasn't meant for her ears. Thomas's voice sharpened. If you want this deal, and we both know you do, you need to think about presentation. Who's in the room? Who's not? A pause thickened the air. Then William, I've already started managing that. A strange cold settled in her chest. It wasn't shock. It was the confirmation of a suspicion that had been whispering at the edges of her mind for months. Thomas exhaled slowly. You're smart. You get it. It's not personal, Will. They have their expectations. The right partner, the right appearance, the right story. We've all seen how they react when something doesn't fit their picture-perfect little world. Yeah, William said quietly. I get it. Leona closed her eyes. The right image, the right appearance, the right story. She didn't need them to say the words. She'd lived in this world long enough to read between the spaces. What they meant was, not her. Not her skin, not her curls, not her laugh that sometimes filled a room without asking permission. Not her presence at the table William was desperate to sit at. She heard Thomas pour another drink. This is the biggest deal of your life, Will. You land this. You're not just a developer. Your legacy. You can't afford distractions. Distractions. She bit the inside of her cheek so hard she tasted copper. William's voice softened in the way it used to when he spoke to her. But now it was aimed at Thomas, at ambition, at image. I know how to play the game, Tom. I know what they want to see. Not me. Leona rose quietly from her chair and walked toward the hallway's end, heart pounding. She stopped short of the living room entrance where the light spilled out in warm, expensive tones. She could see his back, the crisp lines of his shirt, the relaxed set of his shoulders. A man planning a future he hadn't invited her into. Thomas leaned forward on the couch, his voice low but clear. Good. Because let's be honest, those people aren't going to see her the way you do, or the way you used to. And if she walks into that boardroom, they'll see the story they don't want told. William didn't argue. He didn't defend her. He didn't even hesitate. Yeah, he said finally. That's why she won't be there. Leona's nails pressed into her palms until it hurt. She'd always known the world was built on unspoken rules. But she had believed, stupidly, stubbornly, that their marriage was bigger than those rules. That love could outrun the smallness of other people's expectations. But here it was, not whispered by strangers, spoken by her husband. Something shifted inside her then. Not a scream, not a collapse, something quieter, sharper, like a steel beam settling into place. She stepped back into the shadows before they could see her, every movement precise. In the kitchen, she picked up her fallen pencil and stared at the graphite mark on the floor. A tiny gray fracture. That was how it happened, she thought. Not in an explosion, but in a hairline crack that traveled through everything you thought was solid. When William finally came to bed that night, smelling of whiskey and expensive ambition, Leona was already lying on her side, eyes open in the dark. His arm brushed her shoulder. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak. But beneath the stillness, her anger burned low and steady. No longer the ache of confusion, but the beginning of something that would not be easily put out. The roses arrived at dawn, deep red, long-stemmed, tied with a ribbon as black as silk. A card tucked inside read, "For my favorite night in." Leona found them sitting on the marble counter when she came down for coffee, the scent thick in the quiet kitchen. It should have felt romantic. Once it would have. But now the gesture was too perfect, too timed, like a set piece carefully placed in a room meant to be photographed. When William walked in, he looked exactly the way he always did before a big event. Flawless suit, immaculate tie, confidence worn like armor. He kissed her cheek, lingering just long enough to make it seem tender. "I thought these would brighten your day," he said. Leona didn't smile. She just touched the petals, cool and soft beneath her fingers. She could feel the performance in the air. William poured himself a coffee and leaned against the counter, casual and composed. "About tonight," he began, as if discussing dinner plans. "The gala's going to be a long one. A lot of speeches, a lot of small talk. You'd be bored to death." "Bored," she repeated slowly. "It's really more of a business thing this year," he continued smoothly. "Wellington's sending their senior board members, and you know how they are. Old money, very particular. I just think it might be easier if I handle it. You could take the night for yourself. You've been working so hard." There it was, the gentleness sharpened into control. It wasn't a request. It was the velvet wrapping around a decision already made. Leona tilted her head slightly. "I've gone to every gala with you for 8 years, Will. What's different about this one?" He hesitated a fraction of a second too long. "Nothing's different," he said finally. "It's just strategy. Optics. You know how this world works. Optics. A word that had started to mean invisibility." She took a slow sip of her coffee, letting the silence grow between them like smoke. She'd overheard enough of his conversation with Thomas to know what he really meant. She wasn't part of the right image for Wellington's boardroom. Her absence was no accident. It was calculated. William stepped closer, softening his voice, as though talking to a fragile thing he didn't want to break. "After this deal closes, we can get away for a weekend. Aspen, maybe Paris, just the two of us. You deserve a break. Flowers, vacations, distractions." He always offered beauty when he was taking something away. Leona set the cup down carefully, steadying herself against the quiet fury rising beneath her ribs. She wanted to scream, to ask him how a woman who helped him build his empire could suddenly be a liability to his ambition. But she didn't. She looked at the man who'd once held her hand in boardrooms, who'd whispered about building a legacy together, and saw, with stunning clarity, the scaffolding he'd erected around her life. Every strategy, every suggestion, every smile that wasn't quite real. It was architecture, not made of steel or glass, but of expectations and quiet erasure. And she had lived inside it like a house that wasn't hers. "All right," she said finally. Her voice was calm, even. It surprised even her. He blinked, as if expecting a fight. When none came, relief smoothed the edges of his face. "Good. I'll text you when it's over." She nodded and watched him adjust his cufflinks before heading out the door. He didn't look back. When the lock clicked shut, the silence returned. Colder now. She moved through their perfect apartment, past the photographs carefully staged on the wall. Him shaking hands with donors, smiling beside governors, always at the center. Her role, when she appeared at all, was background color. Leona walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the Chicago skyline. The lake stretched into darkness, glassy and still. She imagined the gala, the chandeliers, the golden light, Clara Monroe's polished laugh somewhere in the crowd. She could picture the moment William would pretend she didn't exist. She stayed home, but not in ignorance, not anymore. Something shifted inside her that night, not loud but deep, a new clarity. A woman who has been pushed aside doesn't stay on the margins forever. Sometimes she waits, sometimes she builds, and sometimes she steps back into the center of the room. Not for him, but for herself. The apartment was too quiet, not the gentle quiet of peace, but the kind that swells and presses against the walls, loud in its emptiness. The roses on the counter were beginning to open, their scent heavier now, almost cloying. The last touch of William's cologne lingered faintly in the air, a ghost of a man who had decided she no longer belonged in his picture. Leona stood in front of the tall mirror in their hallway, the one William had insisted on importing from Italy. Its gold frame curved like something from a palace, elegant, excessive, not her. She studied the woman staring back at her. Her dress was soft gray silk, something he'd once said made her look polished, sophisticated. Her hair was pinned back the way he preferred, not the way she liked. She tilted her head slightly, searching her own reflection as if for a stranger's name. This was the image he'd shaped over the years, flawless but muted, beautiful but careful. An accessory, not a partner. For a long time, she just stood there. And then, very slowly, she pulled the pins from her hair one by one. Curls fell around her shoulders like a quiet rebellion. She wiped away the soft rose lipstick. She slipped out of the silk dress and folded it neatly over the chair. The woman left in the mirror was someone different, simpler, real, herself. She walked barefoot into her studio, a room William never entered. It smelled faintly of graphite and old paper. Architectural sketches covered the walls, layered over time like sediment, fragments of her mind made visible. And in the center of the drafting table lay the blueprint she had drawn on a restless night 6 months earlier, long before she had the words to name her unhappiness. It was a design for a community design center in the south side of Chicago. Not a glossy skyscraper, not a luxury condo complex to impress donors. This building was different. It was low, wide, welcoming. Light poured in through open atriums. Trees grew in courtyards. Classrooms opened onto gardens. The heart of the structure was a shared workshop where anyone could come in and make, rebuild, imagine. Leona traced her fingertips over the lines, thin, deliberate, steady. Every room in that design held a piece of her, the girl who grew up on the east side of Detroit, listening to her grandmother talk about dignity like it was something you could build with your own hands. Her grandmother, Leona Carter, used to sit at the kitchen table with her after school, rolling dough for sweet potato pie and telling her, "Baby, they can try to take a lot from you, but they can't take your name, they can't take your voice, and they can't take your dignity unless you give it to them." Leona had carried those words into adulthood like bricks in a foundation. But somewhere along the way, between ribbon cuttings, galas, and the slow erosion of her voice, she'd started setting those bricks aside. Now, staring at the blueprint, she felt them again, solid, weighty, hers. William had his towers of glass and steel, but this center, was her cathedral. Not for the wealthy, but for the people who reminded her of home, for the kid who wanted a place to draw, for the woman starting over, for the neighborhood that deserved beauty just as much as the skyline did. For herself, a gust of wind brushed against the window, making the papers on the table rustle. It felt like something inside her shifting too, a fault line snapping into alignment. For the first time in months, maybe years, she let herself imagine a future without him. A life built not around his ambitions, but around her own. The gala would go on without her. The donors would nod and toast their own reflection. William would charm them with his polished smile. But here, in this quiet room, something far more important was happening. Leona picked up her drafting pencil, steady in her hand. She drew a new line on the blueprint, one she'd been afraid to commit to before. Not because the building needed it, but because she did. It was her signature. When she stepped back, the paper glowed faintly beneath the lamp. It was beautiful. Not perfect, not complete, but alive. It was everything she hadn't been allowed to be in his world. Outside, the city lights stretched endlessly, but for once, Leona didn't feel small beneath them. She felt anchored. And though William didn't know it yet, this was the night the foundation beneath their marriage quietly began to give way. Not because of what he took from her, but because of what she finally decided to reclaim. The call came the next morning, just after the sun cracked the edge of Lake Michigan and turned the apartment's white walls to honey. Leona was still in her studio, hair loose, a sweater thrown over yesterday's dress. The blueprint for the Southside Community Center spread open like a promise she'd finally said aloud. Her phone buzzed across the desk, an unfamiliar DC number. She almost ignored it. Almost. Leona Carter speaking. "Ms. Carter, good morning. This is Eleanor Wellington." The voice was low, cultivated, with the faintest rasp of age and authority. "I chair the Wellington Trust." Leona straightened, heartbeat ticking once, sharp and bright. She saw the roses in the kitchen in her mind's eye, the note in William's hand, the word optics like a stain on polished glass. "Good morning," she said evenly. "How can I help you?" "I've been reviewing your work," Eleanor said. "Your civic projects in Bronzeville, the adaptive reuse on East Garfield, the Willow District concept you presented 3 years ago. You have a way of drawing light into spaces that were convinced they didn't deserve it." Leona felt the words land like a hand against her back, steadying, pushing her quietly forward. "Thank you," she managed. "Those projects mean a great deal to me." "As they should." Paper rustled on the other end of the line, purposeful. We're preparing a major initiative in Washington, Anacostia, Ward 8, a $25 million community revitalization, anchored by an arts and design center, co-op marketplace, youth studios, and senior creative spaces. We've interviewed a dozen firms. Your portfolio rose to the surface and would not sink. Leona moved to the window. The lake flashed like hammered metal in the morning light. I'm honored you thought of me. I'm not extending flattery, Miss Carter. I'm extending leadership. A beat. I want you to lead it. There was a moment of silence in which Leona heard everything she had overheard the night before. Thomas's caution, William's agreement, the right image, the right story. And now, the same family whose approval William was chasing, calling her. What you're proposing, Leona said slowly, measuring each word, is ambitious. Ambitious, yes. Necessary, more so. Eleanor's tone warmed, not softening but revealing. We've spent too long funding things that photograph well and live poorly. I want a building that breathes. A campus where people feel seen the moment they step through the door. I want your eyes on it, your steadiness, your stubborn faith in human dignity. The line hummed. Somewhere in the apartment, a pipe clicked. Leona placed a hand flat on the glass. The city opened beneath her, vast and unsentimental. What would the scope be? A phase plan, Eleanor replied. 12 to 18 months for design and city approvals, then a 2-year build. We have partners lined up. Local schools, a housing nonprofit, a workforce development program. The trust will serve as anchor funder. I intend to hold the line against political theatrics. A faint smile lived in her voice. I assume you can hold yours against architectural theatrics. Leona's laugh came out softer than she expected. I prefer buildings that still make sense when the cameras leave. Good, Eleanor said. Then we are aligned. They discussed timelines, community boards, sustainable materials, how the center would stay open late because some teenagers only exhale after dark. Leona mapped it in her mind while they spoke. A long, low building that met the street without apology, glazing that turned sunset into a public ritual, a courtyard where elders tended planters while children sketched futures in chalk. The blueprint on her desk seemed to glow, as if the ink remembered the hand that drew it. At last, Eleanor paused. I should be transparent. Your name came to me from 2 sources. One of my program directors who follows your work, and a portfolio packet I received last week from a developer seeking our attention. The slightest clink of glass. He did not recommend you. He recommended himself. Yet his materials included photographs of several projects with plaques that bore 2 names. Only one of those names appeared on his proposal. I prefer the truth. Leona closed her eyes. The irony was too clean, almost cruel in its symmetry. I appreciate that, Miss Wellington. So do I. A breath. Can you be in D.C. on Thursday? I'd like you to meet the team and walk the site. If, after that, you still want this, it's yours to lead. Leona looked down at her bare feet, the pale graphite dust on the floor, the life she had allowed to be staged around her like a set. Then she looked back at the drawing, the community center, the open atrium, the rooms that welcomed grief and joy with equal grace. When she spoke, her voice held the steadiness of steel poured and cooled. Yes, she said. Thursday works. Excellent. My office will send flights and an agenda. And Miss Carter? Yes? I am old enough to know the difference between a polished facade and a sound foundation. Your work feels like the latter. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. The call ended as quietly as it had begun. Leona stood for a long moment in the stillness that followed, phone warm in her hand. Then she set it down and returned to the drafting table. The roses in the kitchen perfumed the air like a memory she was already setting free. She rolled out a fresh sheet of vellum and began to draw, not because she had to prove anything, but because something inside her had opened. A door that had been locked from the outside for years. Line by line, a new map of her life took shape. Not an accessory, not an image, a maker. A name on the plaque that would not be erased. Across town, in an office where optics passed for vision, William would soon learn that the room he'd tried to reserve had already been filled. The Wellington Trust made its choice. They chose the foundation. They chose the architect. They chose Leona. The first thing Leona noticed when she stepped off the plane in Washington, D.C. was the light. Chicago's skyline was sharp and cold, all glittering steel against lake wind. But here, the light was softer, filtered through a warmer sky, as if the city itself exhaled differently. She pressed her palm against the railing outside the terminal, steadying herself against a feeling she hadn't expected. Possibility. In the days that followed, she moved through the Wellington Trust's offices like a current. Meetings filled her schedule, blueprints layered her bag, and every conversation cracked open a new space inside her that had been dormant for years. She wasn't standing next to someone else's vision now. She was the vision. Eleanor Wellington greeted her like an equal from the very first meeting. She was elegant but unsentimental, with steel gray hair and a voice that made people sit up straighter. "I don't want a monument," she told Leona. "I want a place where people's lives happen. Make them feel they belong here before the doors even open." Leona nodded, and something electric settled in her chest. "Then we start from the street," she said, "not from the sky." They assembled a team quickly: urban designers, environmental engineers, community representatives. But it was Maya Flores, a young planner fresh out of graduate school, who stood out. Maya's enthusiasm was unpolished, her ideas sprawling but bright. She reminded Leona of herself when she first believed architecture could be a language for justice. During one of their early sessions, Maya laid a sketch on the table, a bold idea for a public atrium that opened onto the street like an invitation. "People shouldn't have to push their way into this building," Maya said. "It should feel like it's already theirs." Leona smiled, tracing the lines with her fingertip. "Yes," she murmured, "exactly." In that moment, something shifted. She was no longer shrinking herself to fit into someone else's boardroom. She was building the room. The project quickly became more than work. It was air. It was proof. Every morning she woke before dawn, lacing her sneakers, walking through the empty streets of D.C. with a thermos of black coffee in hand. By the time she reached the temporary project office, the sky would be paling, the city still quiet enough for her thoughts to echo. She covered the walls with sketches and renderings, floor plans and sections, but also photographs from her childhood, the block in Detroit where she grew up, the community center her grandmother fought to save, the small park where neighborhood kids had painted murals on cracked concrete. She wasn't just designing a building, she was designing a heartbeat, Eleanor noticed. One evening, after a particularly intense planning session, Eleanor lingered as the others filtered out. She stood near the wall of concept renderings, Leona's vision spread out like a city map. "I've worked with many architects," Eleanor said softly. "Most of them build things they want to be remembered for. You're building something people will live in. That's rarer than you might think." Leona didn't answer right away. She was looking at a model Maya had made of the youth studio wing. Simple cardboard and foam, but it glowed under the work lamp. This was what mattered. Not black tie galas, not whispered judgments, not someone else's permission. For the first time in years, her world didn't orbit William Preston. His shadow wasn't here. His voice didn't shape her choices. When she thought about him now, it wasn't with longing or even rage. It was distance. The kind of distance you get when you've stepped fully into your own gravity. In the weeks that followed, the Wellington Project bloomed like a living thing. Neighborhood meetings filled with teenagers, artists, elders, and single mothers became part of the design process. Leona stood at the front of crowded rooms, listening as people shared their stories, what they wanted, what they needed, what they had been denied for too long. She wove their words into concrete and timber, steel and glass. Every element of the design carried fingerprints that weren't just hers, but theirs too. And in giving shape to their hopes, she was rebuilding her own. Sometimes, late at night, she'd catch her reflection in the glass of the office window, hair loose, hands inked with graphite, eyes steady. Not the woman in the gala dress who'd been quietly erased, but the woman who refused to disappear. She was no longer waiting for permission to exist in someone else's story. She was writing her own. And this time, the foundation was hers alone. Clara Monroe arrived without an appointment, the receptionist's voice tight over the intercom. "Miss Carter, there's a woman here asking for you. She says it's personal." Leona looked up from the elevation study, heart resisting the urge to quicken. The office was bright with afternoon sun, the scale model of the youth studio glowing like a small, determined star. "Send her in," she said, and placed her pencil down as if setting a boundary. Clara stepped into the doorway with the poise of someone used to being welcomed. She wore a cream dress that seemed to float, and a smile that almost passed for kind, until you looked at her eyes. There was tension there, a fragile shine, as if the truth inside her had grown heavy enough to bruise. "Miss Carter," she said, "thank you for seeing me." Leona gestured toward the table scattered with drawings. "I have 10 minutes, she replied calmly. It wasn't a performance, it was a decision. Clara moved closer, gaze flicking over the renderings. "You're very good," she said softly. "No one told me that part. I had to find out myself." "What do you want, Ms. Monroe?" Clara blinked, as if bracing for a cold wave. "Honesty," she said, "even if it hurts. Especially if it hurts." She took a breath and delivered it without ornament. "I've been seeing William for 10 months. The words landed like a dropped pane of glass. They didn't shatter, they thudded, solid and ugly, and kept their shape. 10 months. Long enough to turn doubt into a calendar. Long enough for a man to train his lies to sound like routine. Leona didn't flinch. She felt something stranger, a loosening inside her, a hidden knot gently untying. "I suspected," she said. "Not the length, but the fact." Clara's mouth tightened. "He told me you two were complicated, that you'd separated, that you were basically just his ex-wife." She looked away. He said it like he was being noble about it. Leona's jaw softened, but not with sorrow, with a weary comprehension that felt like the opposite of shock. "He revised me," she murmured, half to herself. "Erased the parts that caused friction, kept the parts that earned applause." Clara reached into her handbag and placed a folded note on the table, hotel letterhead, a date circled in blue ink. "I thought I was the only one. I believed him. Then last week I found messages on his tablet from a brunette named Elise. Pictures, plans, a reservation under a fake name. I confronted him. He said, everyone exaggerates, that men like him needed privacy, that I shouldn't be dramatic." She gave a breathless, unhappy laugh. "Imagine calling a woman dramatic in the middle of your self-portrait." Leona's gaze drifted to the model in the corner, the tiny paper courtyard, the gentle ramp leading to the public plaza. She had designed every angle to invite, to tell people they wouldn't be punished for entering. In this moment, she believed her own architecture. "How many?" she asked quietly. "At least 3 that I know of," Clara said. "Likely more he kept outside the frame. I'm not here to wound you. I'm here because the picture he sold both of us was a painting over damp walls." Silence settled. Not hostile, considering. The office clock ticked once. Outside, a siren threaded through traffic and faded. Leona sat, rested her hands on the edge of the drafting table, and felt the grain of the wood anchor her. She could see the night she'd stood in front of their mirror, unpinning her hair. The dawn when Eleanor Wellington had called her by her name, and not by her proximity to someone else. The afternoon spent with Maya, letting a neighborhood's voice shape the plan. All of it drew together now into a single, continuous line. "Why come to me?" she asked at last. Clara's shoulders lowered, as if she'd set down a heavy bag. "Because I realized I was advancing a story that harmed another woman," she said. "Because I believed I was special when I was only convenient. Because he said you weren't a good fit, and then I read about your work and understood what he edits when the truth doesn't flatter him." Her voice thinned. "And because I don't want to become him." Leona let the words breathe. She surprised herself by feeling no desire to humiliate, no appetite for a scene. Grief moved through her like a tide, lifting and lowering without washing her away. The devastation she'd braced for did not arrive. Something else did. Clarity. Cool and exact. "You're not my enemy, Clara," she said. "You're a symptom." She stood, and the room seemed to stand with her. "He curated reality. We cooperated, for different reasons." Clara nodded, shame and relief mixing in her eyes. "I'm ending it," she said. "I already have. I don't know what he'll say about me next, but I wanted you to hear the truth without his fingerprints on it." Leona inclined her head. "Thank you." They stood a moment longer in the quiet office, Two women on different sides of a narrowing river. Clara glanced at the renderings again, at the light-swept atrium, at the hand-drawn notes peppered with community comments. "You're building something that will outlive him," she said softly. "I'm building something that will outlive me," Leona corrected, and felt the certainty of it settle into her bones. Clara left as gently as she'd arrived. The door clicked shut. Leona walked to the window and watched the city move. Buses shouldering corners, a child tugging an adult's hand, a man selling oranges from a cart like small sons. She pressed her palm to the glass and, for the first time since the roses on the counter, inhaled without effort. 10 months. Other women. The revision of her life into a footnote. All of it was true. None of it was final. She turned back to the table, pulled the latest site plan toward her, and drew a firm line through the center courtyard, widening it by a few precious feet. Space for more light. Space for people to pass each other without shrinking. Space to look up and feel the sky. Devastation had come to the threshold and found no room to live. In its place, clarity laid out her tools. Steady hands, an earned name, and a blueprint that belonged to no one but her. The laughter came first. Low, easy, careless. It slid through the thin crack of the study door like smoke. Leona had returned to the apartment late, papers still dusted with the scent of graphite and coffee. She wasn't supposed to hear anything. But William and Thomas were in the living room, their voices confident in the way men speak when they believe no one is listening. She paused at the corner of the hallway, her hand against the cool wall. "I told you," Thomas said, his voice dry, half laughing. "It worked out perfectly. She's been practically invisible since the Wellington talks started. No drama, no headlines, no awkward optics." William's chuckle followed, deep and satisfied. "Yeah, it's cleaner this way. Everyone sees me as a focused, family-minded guy without the complications." "Complications?" Thomas teased. "You mean your wife?" William exhaled through his nose. The sounds she used to think meant stress, but now heard for what it was, contempt smoothed into indifference. "You know how this game works. Certain images open doors, others close them. She's a good woman, Tom, but she's never been the right face for this level of the table. She doesn't belong in those rooms." A silence stretched, soft and terrible. Thomas poured himself another drink. She could hear the clink of ice against glass. "And she's buying it?" "She's tired," William said. "She's buried in her own work. She'll come around, or she won't. Either way, I've already positioned everything cleanly. She's off the grid when I need her to be. No questions." Every word landed like steel nails pressed into glass. Not rage, not even heartbreak, just a deep, crystalline stillness spreading through her, so cold it burned. This wasn't about infidelity anymore. It wasn't even about love. It was about how seamlessly he had edited her out of his life. The way a developer deletes an inconvenient structure from a rendering. No cracks, no jagged edges, just gone. She turned away before she could hear anything else. Walked down the hallway to their bedroom. No, his bedroom now, because it was built on his script, not her truth. She opened the closet doors. For a long moment, she stood before rows of curated dresses, shoes she'd worn to galas where she'd been more ornament than partner. Then, without drama, she began to pack. Her essentials: 2 suits, 1 pair of jeans, a soft sweater, her grandmother's ring, her sketchbooks, and the drafting pencil she'd carried since grad school. A toothbrush. A worn leather folio. That was all. The rest, the gowns, the polished heels, the shell of a role she no longer accepted, could rot in the dark of this glass house. The letter was short, 3 sentences written in her measured hand. "William, I know everything. I refuse to be an accessory in a story I helped build." She left it on the marble counter, beside the vase of roses that were now beginning to wither at the edges. How poetic, she thought absently. He'd built an entire illusion around those flowers. The city outside was slick with rain when she walked out. Her suitcase wheels whispered against the lobby tiles. The doorman looked at her, puzzled, but she smiled. It wasn't a bright smile. It was sharper than that, honest, final. She didn't call anyone, didn't look back. The taxi driver asked no questions when she gave him the address of a small boutique hotel near the river, a place she had passed 100 times but never entered. The front desk clerk checked her in with the warm detachment reserved for strangers who look like they know exactly what they're doing. The room was small, clean, high ceilings, soft lamps, pale wood floors. No trace of him, no trace of them. She set her suitcase down and sat on the edge of the bed, fingers pressing into the duvet. The hum in her chest, the one she hadn't even realized she carried for years, was quiet now. Not gone, but finally allowed to breathe. For a long time she just listened, to the rain against the window, to the hollow quiet where his voice used to live, to the slow settling of her own heartbeat. When she finally lay down, she didn't toss or turn. Her mind didn't loop through what-ifs and should-haves. The weight of the room wrapped around her like something honest. Leona Carter, architect, woman, no longer someone's complication, fell asleep as the rain sang against the glass, and for the first time in years, she slept without flinching. No roses, no mirrors, no permission, only the quiet, vast space of a life she would now build for herself. The lease on the old textile building was signed in the spring. The air that morning held the crisp bite of early sunlight, the kind that makes everything feel newly built, even the cracked sidewalks outside the brick structure she had chosen. It wasn't much to look at. Faded red walls, big windows clouded by years of city grit, echoes still trapped inside from its industrial past. But as Leona stood in the center of the empty space, hands on her hips, she saw what others couldn't. She saw blueprints in the bones of the building. She saw possibility. This was not Williams' glass penthouse, polished to impress people who measured worth by mirrors and marble. This was rougher, real, hers. Carter's studio was born with nothing more than a few desks, 2 laptops, a whiteboard streaked with ambition, and the kind of hunger that isn't about money, but about building something that matters. She didn't need chandeliers. She needed light, and light was already pouring in through the tall windows, spilling across the floor like a promise. The first few weeks were a storm. Contractors installing new wiring, designers she'd handpicked painting the walls themselves, late nights sketching logo drafts and website copy on scrap paper. But beneath the chaos, something steady pulsed. Purpose. Word about her leadership on the Wellington project had spread. It started with a quiet article in an architecture journal, then another in a civic design magazine. People weren't just talking about what she was building. They were talking about why. They quoted her line from an early community meeting. Architecture should not ask people to prove they belong. It should prove it belongs to them. Eleanor Wellington became a quiet but powerful ally. She introduced Leona to planners, funders, cultural institutions. Instead of being asked to stand beside someone else's vision, Leona now sat at the head of the table, unapologetically. Her posture changed first. The woman who used to fold her hands in her lap at galas now walked into boardrooms with her shoulders back and her gaze steady. She wore clothes that felt like her, structured jackets in warm earth tones, wide-legged trousers, clean lines, unapologetic color. No more shrinking herself to fit into Williams' carefully curated world. Her voice followed, clear, grounded, no longer softening her brilliance to make room for someone else's ego. She began to notice how people leaned forward when she spoke now, how they took notes when she outlined an idea. And then came the young architects. One by one, they found their way to her door. Black, Latina, Asian, first-generation designers who had grown up with the same unspoken rules Leona once fought to navigate. They came with portfolios and shaking hands, eyes bright with the kind of ambition that burns, but hasn't yet been given oxygen. Leona made space for them. She carved out part of Carter Studio's second floor as a workshop. Messy, loud, alive. This is not a waiting room for permission, she told them. This is where you learn to build your own table. Among them was Ava Jackson, a 23-year-old from the South Side who sketched entire housing developments in the margins of old notebooks. There was Luis Mendoza, whose first community center design used recycled shipping containers and somehow made them sing. There was Nia Clark, soft-spoken, fierce-eyed, with a gift for public spaces that felt like home. They didn't call her Miss Carter, they called her Leona, and she liked that. The Wellington project became the anchor of her new life. She walked the site in hard hats and boots, listening to crews, shaking hands with neighborhood elders who thanked her for seeing them. When reporters asked about vision, she didn't give polished sound bites. She talked about light, about dignity, about how brick can hold memory. There were nights when she stayed in the office long after everyone left, sitting by the window with a cup of tea, the city breathing quietly outside. She no longer replayed William's words in her head. She replayed her own. The rhythm of them was different, firmer, steadier, entirely hers. The most surprising part wasn't the success. It was the calm that came with it. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was performing for anyone, not proving, not fighting for a seat she'd already earned. She simply existed, brilliant, visible, unshakable. Some mornings, she caught her reflection in the mirror by the stairwell as she arrived early to open the studio. No jewelry except the gold ring that had belonged to her grandmother. No mask of control. Just a woman who had learned that building a legacy isn't about creating something that sparkles. It's about creating something that stays. And this time, the foundation didn't have cracks. It was hers, laid one deliberate, unstoppable line at a time. The invitation came in a thick cream envelope, the kind embossed with weight and intention. The words, Wellington Winter Gala, were pressed in gold, but it wasn't the shimmer that made Leona pause. It was the line beneath it, the one written with the elegant restraint of a family that had ruled rooms for generations. Guest of honor, Leona Carter. She read it twice, then once more. A season ago, she had stood on the balcony of another ballroom, uninvited, erased, watching William Preston charm the same people who now wrote her name in gold. This time, she wouldn't be standing on the edges. When the night arrived, Chicago was dressed in snowlight, the city soft and glittering. Leona stepped out of the car in a gown of deep burgundy silk, a color chosen not for approval but for power. It caught the light like warm wine. Her hair was unpinned, full and unapologetic, and the cold kissed her cheeks as though the city itself bowed in quiet recognition. The Wellington Gala was everything she remembered. Chandeliers dripping crystal, orchestras in black tuxedos, champagne glasses that never seemed to empty. But she had changed. The space no longer felt like a stage she needed to tiptoe across. It felt like a room waiting for her to claim it. People noticed the moment she entered. Conversations faltered, just slightly. Heads turned. Not out of scandal this time, but out of something heavier. Attention. Recognition. The kind of energy that used to circle William like a crown now belonged to her. Near the far wall, Clara Monroe stood in soft ivory silk, her posture smaller than the woman who once smirked beside William. William himself lingered by the bar, surrounded by a thinning halo of acquaintances who no longer treated him like the sun. His eyes found Leona instantly. A flicker of something, surprise, regret, maybe both, passed over his face. But she didn't flinch. She didn't look away. Eleanor Wellington appeared like a force of grace and command, gliding through the crowd in navy satin. "My dear," she said warmly, taking Leona's hands, "you look extraordinary. Tonight, they're here for you." Leona felt the room settle around her like a perfectly tailored suit. "I know," she said, her voice steady. Then came the moment that would rewrite the story. Eleanor led her to the stage at the center of the ballroom, where the great and powerful of DC society sat beneath chandeliers like an audience awaiting a performance. But this wasn't theater. This was reclamation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Eleanor began, her voice carrying through the room like silk over steel. "When the Wellington Trust began its community revitalization initiative, we searched for vision. What we found was Leona Carter, an architect who builds not just with glass and concrete, but with the unshakable belief that dignity belongs to everyone." The crowd hushed. The sound of cutlery and conversation stilled. "Her work is not about legacy for the few," Eleanor continued, her eyes gleaming, "but possibility for the many. She reminds us that beauty belongs on every street, not just the ones with names on plaques." Then she stepped aside and Charles Wellington, the patriarch himself, a man who'd once quietly approved of excluding Leona from a room like this, approached the microphone. He was tall, silver-haired, dressed like history itself, and yet his smile as he turned toward Leona was disarmingly warm. "When Eleanor first told me about this young architect," Charles began. I expected blueprints and metrics. What I didn't expect was vision, one that reminded me why we build in the first place. Miss Carter, you have changed how we see our responsibility to this city, and tonight we are honored to celebrate you. Applause broke like a wave, but it wasn't polite applause, the kind that drifts off quickly. It was full, long, real. The same investors who once pretended not to see her now leaned forward in their chairs. The same old money voices that dismissed her as a bad fit now rose to their feet. Leona stood tall in the center of it all. She didn't shrink, didn't blush, didn't lower her gaze to seem humble for their comfort. She lifted her chin, shoulders square, the light catching on the curve of her dress. She belonged, not because they let her in, but because she had built the door herself. At the edge of the room, William's champagne glass hovered at his lips, forgotten. Clara's fingers were knotted in the fabric of her gown. Neither of them held the room anymore. The power that had once defined him had become a footnote in her story. After the speeches, people crowded around her. Donors, designers, reporters, young architects wanting to shake her hand. Her name floated through the air like a current. Not William's wife, not the complication, just Leona Carter. When Charles Wellington approached again, this time without a microphone, he offered her his arm with a faint, respectful smile. "You've built something remarkable," he said, "and tonight the city knows it." "I didn't build it alone," she replied softly, "but I made sure my name stayed on it." He laughed quietly, understanding more than she expected. And as she crossed the ballroom on Charles Wellington's arm, the same space where she once stood frozen and invisible, Leona realized that this was the mirror image of that night. The chandeliers were the same. The crowd was the same. But she was not. Power had shifted, not with noise, but with the weight of a woman who finally refused to disappear. William appeared in her periphery, the way a storm appears on the edge of a clear sky. Not sudden, but inevitable. The crowd around Leona was a shifting constellation of hands and smiles and congratulations. A warmth that had once surrounded him and now belonged wholly to her. She felt him before she saw him. The familiar scent of his cologne. The practiced weight of his footsteps. "Leona," he said, and the single word was loaded with history. His voice was as smooth as it had always been, a blend of practiced warmth and controlled urgency. She turned. William stood a step too close, dressed in a tuxedo that looked tailored to a man still convinced the world owed him its gaze. For a fleeting moment, his expression softened, like a gambler smiling at a familiar deck. "You look incredible," he said, tilting his head. "I almost didn't recognize you." "You didn't recognize me when we were married," she replied evenly. It wasn't venom, just truth, delivered without heat. Truth has a way of sounding louder when it doesn't need to shout. His jaw tightened, but his smile didn't falter. "We should talk," he said, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "Not here. Somewhere private." But before she could respond, Charles Wellington approached, as if summoned by the weight of their shared past. His presence cut through the air like the edge of a finely honed blade. William's shoulders straightened instinctively. The room, already attuned to Leona, noticed the shift. "Mr. Preston," Charles said, his tone exquisitely polite, "I've been meaning to have a word with you." He offered no handshake. It was deliberate. A handshake implies equality. This moment did not. William forced a grin. "Mr. Wellington, of course. It's an honor. I've admired your work for years." Charles glanced briefly at Leona, then back at William with the kind of calm that comes from having nothing to prove. "That's interesting," he said mildly, "because the last time your firm sent us a proposal, it was for this very project. Only, I seem to recall your packet contained several photographs of work attributed entirely to you, when in fact, the work belonged to Miss Carter." A low murmur rippled through the crowd nearby, not loud enough to be called gossip, but soft enough to cut deeper. William's smile faltered. "That must have been a misunderstanding," he began smoothly. "Our team—" "I'm quite familiar with misunderstandings," Charles interrupted, still gentle, still devastating. "I've seen men build entire careers on them. Fortunately, I prefer truth." The social temperature in the room shifted by degrees. People who had once angled toward William were now angling away, their gazes pulled like gravity toward Leona. She didn't move. She didn't need to. Her silence was doing more than his performance ever could. William swallowed, color rising faintly to his neck. Charles, I think we're getting off on the wrong. Mr. Preston, Charles said softly, almost kindly. When someone tries to erase a person from their own work, it's not a misunderstanding. It's a choice. He gave a small, measured nod to Leona. And tonight, everyone here knows who made this happen. William's polished charm cracked, hairline first, then widening like glass under pressure. Around them, donors, planners, and power brokers stood in careful silence, the kind that doesn't wait for the loser's excuse. Leona finally spoke. Her voice was calm, steady, almost serene. You spent years building a story that required me to be invisible. That must feel a lot harder now that I'm not. His throat worked as if he wanted to reach for her, for the old version of her, the woman who once made herself smaller to fit the room he designed. But she wasn't there anymore. And then Clara Monroe appeared. She'd been standing near the back, her ivory dress pale against the ballroom's gold. Her face was composed at first, perfectly, desperately composed. But as William's poise unraveled, hers did too. "Will," she said, just loud enough for the nearest guest to hear. "You told me you never lied to them." Her voice cracked, not with volume, but with the thin sound of someone realizing the stage she stood on was made of glass. He turned sharply, caught between two pasts colliding in real time. "Clara," he hissed, low and brittle. "Not now." But the room was already watching. Not because of scandal. People like these had seen scandal before. They were watching because this time he was no longer the gravitational center. She was, and the air carried it like a current. William Preston was no longer untouchable. Clara's hands twisted in the fabric of her dress, the cracks in her facade widening under the weight of attention. For the first time, she wasn't the polished accessory on his arm. She was just another woman who had believed the story he told about himself. Leona met her eyes briefly. She didn't offer pity. She offered something quieter, recognition. William tried one last time, his voice lowered to the tone he used to use to disarm her. "Leona," he murmured, "you don't have to do this here." She straightened, not in defiance, but in ownership. "I'm not doing anything," she said softly. "I'm just standing where I should have been all along." The murmurs around them weren't cruel. They were conclusive. The current had shifted permanently. William Preston wasn't a power to court anymore. He was a cautionary tale. Charles Wellington lifted his glass slightly, a gesture both subtle and final. The crowd followed his lead, turning their attention back to Leona. Around them, the music began again, the strings swelling, the world moving on without him at the center. William remained standing there, polished suit, empty hands, out of orbit. Leona turned away, the soft burgundy silk of her gown catching the light like a flame refusing to be dimmed. The gallery in Washington smelled faintly of varnish and new paint, the ritual scent of a room preparing to remember. Photographs of buildings lined the walls in clean grids, schools that let the sun in like a hymn, libraries breathing under timber ribs, a community center whose glass held dusk the way cupped hands hold water. Leona stood before the largest print, an evening shot of the Wellington atrium filled with people. The light inside looked like a decision. She didn't see him arrive. She felt the shift first, a small gravity pressing against the edge of her awareness. When she turned, William was there, older by angles rather than years, wearing the kind of suit that used to declare wealth and now only fit a man trying to hold himself together. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The room murmured around them, oblivious. "Leona," he said, voice stripped of its polish. "Thank you for not walking away." "I wasn't moving," she answered. It was true. She wasn't the one approaching history. He looked past her to the photograph, then back to her face. "It's beautiful," he said. "You made it beautiful." His throat worked. "I told myself I had good reasons, that I was protecting us, that I was navigating a world stacked against people who don't fit the picture. But I was protecting me, my ambition, my fear." He swallowed. "And yes, my racism, the polite kind, the kind that smiles and edits. I thought image was everything. I thought reputation would save me. I told myself you were A complication. He said the last word as if it hurt to touch. Leona let the silence hold. It didn't feel like power. It felt like clarity. "What do you want from me, William?" "Not forgiveness," he said quickly, and she believed him. "I don't deserve that. I wanted, no, I needed, to say it out loud, where it could no longer dress itself as strategy. I was a coward. I used you when it suited me and hid you when it didn't. I lied to people who trusted me. And when it all collapsed, I told myself I'd been misled by men more powerful than me." He gave a thin, humorless smile. "Turns out there weren't any men more powerful than me in that story. Just me." "Your firm," she said. A statement, not a question. "Gone," he answered, "or what's left isn't mine." The Wellington deal died the night of the gala. Others followed, some because of ethics inquiries, most because the phone stopped ringing. He exhaled through his nose, tired. Clara left. The version of myself that needed women to be mirrors left with her. I don't miss him. A quiet passed between them, not warm and not cold. A hallway between rooms. He took one step closer, careful, as though the floor might announce his intent. "You were always the architect," he said. "I told the world it was me so many times I started to believe it. I'm sorry, Leona. I am so—" He stopped, as if he'd found the limit of what apology can do. She studied him. Not the suit or the mouth that once turned approval into currency, but the eyes, which had finally learned how to look at her without a plan. She felt no surge of triumph, no ache to rewind time. This was not a circle closing. It was a door that had been standing open for months, and now, at last, would be shut. "I don't hate you," she said. The words were steady, unadorned. "Hate is a tether. I cut mine a long time ago." She glanced at the photograph again. A boy running under the atrium's glow. An older woman smiling from a bench, as if some private inventory had just balanced. "But I no longer belong in your world. I built my own." He nodded, eyes shining but not breaking. "You did," he said softly, "and it's better." People drifted past them, pausing to read captions, to point at details only the attentive notice. Someone laughed in the corner, the kind of laugh that belongs to ordinary joy. The building in the photograph did what she had asked of it, held strangers gently until they recognized themselves as neighbors. "Will you be all right?" she asked, not because she owed him the question, but because her grandmother had taught her that dignity doesn't require bitterness to stand. "I think so," he said. "I'm learning how to be someone who doesn't need a room to be smaller than him to feel big." A wry tilt of his mouth. "It's harder work than I expected." "It's real work," she replied. William looked at her a final time, as if memorizing not her face, but the fact that she was not coming with him. "Goodbye, Leona." "Goodbye, William." He stepped away, and the gallery didn't shift with him. The current stayed where it was, around the woman in burgundy, around the work that refused to apologize for whom it welcomed. Leona turned back to the photograph. In the glass, she saw her reflection layered over the building, a palimpsest of steel and skin, of brick and breath. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from Maya. "Site walk at 8. Elders Committee wants to add fruit trees to the courtyard. You'll love it." Another from a young architect she'd begun mentoring. "Just got my first city contract. Couldn't have done it without your notes." Hers was the empire that didn't look like one. No towers staking claims against the sky. No names carved 12 feet high. It lived in late-night drafts and morning sidewalks, in classrooms that smelled of sawdust and possibility, in the quiet confidence of architects who didn't need permission to see. Around her, the exhibition hummed. Somewhere on the far wall, a photograph captured a ribbon cutting she hadn't attended because they'd done it without speeches, just doors opening and people walking in. She breathed in, slow and full. The chapter did not slam shut. It settled. And in that settling, the room felt larger, as if the walls had been moved back to make space for what was next. The lights in the National Building Museum were soft and golden, casting long, clean lines across the marble floor. The stage was framed by the faces of architects, planners, students, community builders, people who shaped cities not only with steel and concrete, but with dreams and stubborn hope. At the podium, Leona Carter stood with the Thompson Prize for Social Impact in Architecture in her hands. The glass award caught the light and scattered it like sunlight through a window. For a moment, she didn't speak. She simply looked out at the crowd and let the stillness fill the room. She remembered when rooms like this one weren't built for her. She remembered the nights she thought power only lived on the other side of glass walls. Not anymore. When I was 8 years old, she began, voice steady and warm, my grandmother used to walk me past an abandoned factory on our street in Detroit. The bricks were crumbling, windows shattered. But every time she'd say, "Baby, imagine what this could be." She didn't see ruins. She saw a future that belonged to us. She saw space where people like us mattered. The room was silent, the way rooms get when truth walks in. When I started out, she continued, I thought architecture was about building something impressive enough to make people notice me. But then I learned, it's not about being noticed. It's about making spaces where people see themselves. She lifted the award slightly, not like a trophy, but like a blueprint. This isn't mine alone. It belongs to every person who ever walked through a door and wondered if they were allowed to stay. It belongs to my community, to the neighborhoods that taught me that beauty isn't a luxury, it's a right. The applause came like a wave, loud, rising, alive. She saw Eleanor Wellington's proud smile, Maya's tearful grin, the young architects she'd mentored standing in the back, their faces bright with the kind of fire that doesn't burn out. And somewhere far from the spotlight, the past, William, the ballroom, the mirror, had already faded to dust. Just a name from another chapter. Her story was no longer about what she had escaped. It was about what she had built. 2 weeks later, winter sunlight stretched over the east side of Detroit. The ground was cold and hard, but the air buzzed with movement. Excavators growling, rebar glinting, the rhythmic clang of steel against steel. Leona stepped onto the construction site in a hard hat and boots, mud splattering the hem of her jeans. Before her stood the skeleton of a new youth design center, a space that would belong to the next generation of dreamers, sketchers, and builders. The same kind of center she once imagined standing outside that old abandoned factory. She ran her hand along the framing of a future wall, feeling the cold metal warm beneath her palm. She didn't need a gala or anyone's permission. This was her language now. Beams, blueprints, and belief. Behind her, Maya was giving instructions to a group of local apprentices. Ava, Luis, and Nia, the young architects she had mentored, were working side by side with neighborhood teens, measuring, marking, laughing. There were no gatekeepers here, just builders, just belonging. Leona tilted her head up toward the sky, exhaling. Detroit's winter sun was weak but steady, like the start of something. In this city, on this ground, her legacy was no longer a concept. It was rising from the earth. She thought of her grandmother, of the blueprint on her old drafting table, of every door she'd once been told she didn't belong behind. And then she smiled. Not the polite smile of a woman who's grateful to be included, but the full, quiet smile of a woman who built the house herself. This was the foundation she chose. Not glass, not illusions, steel, brick, people. And as the hum of the construction site filled the air, she whispered to herself, let's build. If Leona's journey moved you, share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that they can build their own foundation too. Like, comment, and follow for more stories of power, resilience, and becoming.